Hey guys, here today with my head technician, Marky over there, and we're gonna be working on the old PW80 today. So we're gonna do a basic overhaul on this thing and try to squeeze a little bit more performance out of it too. And this is gonna be the bike that this guy rides when he outgrows that 50, probably in a year or two. All right, so quick preview of the things that I cover in this video. So I wanted to make this thing handle a little bit better and support an adult rider because I ride this a lot when I'm chasing my kids on their 50s and my wife rides it. So I rebuilt the forks and I put spacers on top of the springs to stiffen it up a little bit, put a little bit heavier oil in it. Did a huge difference. One of my least favorite things about the PW80 is how soft the stock rear spring and shock are. So I put a KX65 shock and spring in here, and that is probably the single best modification that I did to this bike because it completely transforms it. I re-geared it for more low end, so I did the front and rear sprockets. And then finally, I modified the stock exhaust system. There is a pretty major restriction in the pipe right here, so I cut that out. And then the expansion chamber also has a really small outlet. You can't really see it from here, but I cut out the small pipe and put in a larger diameter pipe, and then I also put on a bigger diameter silencer, which sounds just a little bit louder than stock, but overall it made quite a difference in the overall performance of the bike. So if any of those things seem interesting to you, keep watching. All right, well, I got the bike all torn down, and it probably took me, I don't know, about 2.5 hours to get to this point, just kind of taking my time and keep things organized. And I'm working on the forks now. And these are pretty easy to work on. You just need a 6mm hex to pull out the bolt in the bottom. And when you do that, you're gonna drain the fluid. And it's also going to free up the shaft so that this can come all the way out, because this bolt is what holds that in there. And then at the top, you just pull off this plug. And then you need a 8mm hex to loosen that little cap. And that's what holds the spring down. So once you loosen that up, you'll be able to take the spring out. So here's the fork spring, and the idea here is to put a spacer on top of it so that you give it a little bit of preload. So I was digging around through my hardware, and I didn't have any PVC. That's what a lot of people use. And then I found this piece of 3/8 pipe, and that's a perfect diameter, so it's gonna cut off some 1-inch pieces of that. And then I found these little spacers here, or bushings. I'm not even sure what they were originally meant for, but they're perfect. So I'm gonna use those. They're like 0.85 inches, so they're almost an inch tall. So they'll be perfect. I'm gonna drop those in there on top of the springs. So the last thing I'm gonna do before I reassemble this fork is I'm going to replace the seal in here. So we're gonna use a little pick or a screwdriver to pull out that retaining clip. And I'm going to use a seal puller to pop the seal out of there and tap a new seal in. And then this fork will be fully rebuilt. All right, new seal is in. So next we're going to put the bolt back in the bottom. And then we're going to refill this with oil. And you do that with the fork completely compressed and without the spring. And we want to fill it till it's 6.5 inches from the top. So I'm probably gonna find something to use as a makeshift dipstick, because it's gonna be hard to measure down in there. And then after that, we put the spring back in, put our spacer on top of it, put the little plug in that holds the spring in, and put the cap on the top. All right, putting in some 15 weight. There's my fancy zip tie dipstick. I'm gonna go ahead and fill it up. All right, that part's done. Got the oil in. I put the spring in. I'm going to decompress this. I'm gonna pull up on this, and then I can put my spacer in there. I'm gonna have to push down on that to compress the spring a little bit to get the spacer in there. Put the little plug in at the end to hold the spring in there, and then put the cap back on. Well, that's it. Spring retainer plug is back in there on top of the spacer. Took a little bit of force to compress the spring enough to get that little threaded plug started, but not too bad. Don't forget to put your dust boot back on before you go any further. And then after you get it back on the bike, you'll put the plug back on because that goes on top of the triple tree. And that fork is done. Hopefully it's a lot stiffer now and it'll support me a little bit better than it did before. All right, so upgrading this rear shock is actually the mod that I'm most excited about, because this thing with me sitting on it is almost bottomed out. I hit the slightest little bump and I feel the thing bottom out, and I'm about 190 pounds or so. So on Marketplace, I found this, and this is a Works Racing shock for a Kawasaki KX65. It is about 1.5 inches longer, so it's going to lift the bike a little bit, and you can see the spring is quite a bit heavier, so it should support my weight a whole lot better. I'm just going to clamp the reservoir to the frame right across from the oil tank, and I can't wait to see how this thing handles now with the forks done and this shock on there. So I'm almost ready to start reassembling the bike and get this on here and finally take it for a ride. So I just got finished test fitting the KX65 shock, and I'm really happy with the way it turns out. It fits in there perfectly. So the mounting point is a little bit narrower on this, so I just stacked a few washers to keep it centered so it can't walk side to side. Same thing on this end over here. The reservoir fits perfectly in there. However, if you are running the oil injection, this would be right where your oil tank is. I pre-mixed, so I'm not running the oil tank. You wouldn't be able to mount this here because this is right where the exhaust goes right through the frame. So if you want a reservoir shock, you have to figure out a different way to mount it unless you delete the oil injection like I did. So for me, this works perfectly and I can't wait to ride it. Okay, rear sprocket change time. It's pretty easy to get the rear wheel off. All you gotta do is take out the axle, and then you gotta disconnect the brake cable from here. There's just a little wing nut that you loosen, and then there's a little bar that goes right here, so you gotta take that off. After that, the wheel will come right off. We got 4 bolts right here. I'm just gonna use a 14mm on an impact to zip those out of there, clean up the hub, and put the new sprocket on. Rear sprocket is installed. It does have nuts on the other side, but you don't have to put a wrench or anything on them because they can't spin. So that's that. So the front sprocket is really easy to get at even when it is on the bike. It's just 4 screws to get the cover off. You gotta take off the shifter and then you pull this off. And there's your front sprocket right there. All it is a snap ring holding that thing on. So you take off the snap ring, pull the gear off, and put your new one on. Put that snap ring back on, put the cover back on, and that's it. So since I've got my exhaust off anyway, I figured I'd open up the end that bolts up to the cylinder head, because it goes down to, geez, it's gotta be like a little over a 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna go ahead and take my die grinder and open that up to free it up a little bit. I'm gonna use one of these little bits, and this should shred through that in just a few minutes. Here's what it looks like with that pipe opened up. That little piece right there, that is what I removed. And you'll see people refer to this as the cone in the exhaust. So that little bit that I had on my die grinder took care of this in, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. So that should help it to breathe a bit. To really take advantage of this, I'd have to cut off that little tiny outlet right there and weld in a larger diameter pipe going from this to the silencer. So I will do that at some point, but for now, since I had it off, I just want to take care of that restriction right there. So I decided it was kind of pointless to remove the restriction on this end of the exhaust if I'm just going to leave this little tiny pipe on this end of the exhaust. So I went on Amazon and I found a 22mm silencer. The inner diameter of this is just a tad over 19mm, so that should be perfect. And I bought a piece of 3/4 inch conduit, which is right around 20.5mm inner diameter, so that should work out well. I soaked this overnight in vinegar to lift the galvanized coating because that stuff is toxic to weld on. So what I'm going to do now is take a hole saw and I'm going to cut that piece of pipe off of there now that I ground it off. And I'm going to mock the silencer up on the bike. I'm going to put the exhaust back on, and then I'm going to see where I need to cut this piece to make it line up. And then I'm going to weld that to there. And I'm not a great welder, but neither is the person who welded this at the factory, so I'm not too worried about it. And then I'm just going to use a piece of rubber hose and some clamps to couple this to there. So once I got that little piece of pipe out of there, I ended up using my grinder to open up that hole. And now that pipe's gonna fit in there just like that. I'm gonna go ahead and mock it up and see where I need to bend, where I need to cut this. And then I'm gonna take it back apart and weld it. So after some cutting, welding, grinding, and painting, this is what I've ended up with. It's not beautiful, but it should work just fine. So this is going to connect right here to the silencer. And they're going to be coupled together with some heavy-duty heater hose and some clamps. So here it is all wrapped up with some new tires and some new decals. Overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. With the airbox opened up and the exhaust opened up, it really revs out higher than it used to, which is awesome. Honestly, the bike's never going to be a powerhouse. Like, it's not going to be a race bike or anything like that. It's not what this thing's meant for. But with the suspension done up for an adult rider and a little extra power in the gears, it really is a fun bike to ride. And with the automatic, anybody can jump on and ride this thing. So good luck with yours.